Welcome. You're here now, and there's nothing else you need to do. Let your shoulders soften. Let the thoughts slow down. You've carried enough for one day, and this time is yours. We're about to drift through the quiet past, a calm, slow journey through history, told gently so you can rest deeply. You don't need to remember the facts. You don't need to stay awake. Just let the words move like waves and settle into stillness as we begin. In the fading mist of ancient Japan, before neon lights and bullet trains, before cities hummed with the sound of progress, there were warriors who walked softly and carried centuries of honor on their shoulders. They were called samurai. This is not a story of battle alone. It is the story of presence, of structure, of silence, of how human beings shaped their entire identity around loyalty, service, and the quiet power of discipline. To know the samurai is to walk into the marrow of Japanese culture. And to walk with them, we begin at the beginning. The origins of the samurai stretch back more than 1,000 years, to a time when Japan was fractured, not just geographically, but spiritually. The imperial court in Kyoto governed from a distance, its influence fading with every mountain range and river bend. Beyond the reach of palace officials, regional clans began to assert their own authority, not through decrees or seals, but through swords. It was the Heian period, and Japan was entering an age of transformation. Local aristocrats, called daimyo, needed protection from bandits, rebels, and rival clans. They began to arm their most loyal men, those who could fight with discipline, who could ride swiftly between estates, who could guard tax caravans and defend ancestral lands. These were the early Bushi, the warriors. Over time, they came to be known as samurai. The word samurai comes from the verb saburao, meaning to serve, and that is where their identity was forged, not in conquest, but in service. Service to a lord, service to a land, service to a set of values that, though unwritten at first, would eventually shape the soul of a nation. At the beginning, there was no formal code, but there was conduct. Warriors were expected to act with discipline, to speak with restraint, to kill only when necessary. Honor was not defined, it was demonstrated. Loyalty was not declared, it was lived. Families passed down more than weapons. They passed down posture, bearing, memory. Boys learned to ride by the time they could run. They learned to shoot arrows from horseback, to kneel for elders, to sit in silence without complaint. Even then, the body was seen as the first battlefield. If one could not control breath, how could one control a sword? As the Bushi class gained prominence, they began to wear symbols of their lineage. Helmets were adorned with family crests. Armor was crafted not only for defense, but for identity. Their presence became unmistakable, their silence unshakable, their word unbreakable. And though battles raged between rival clans, what grew in their midst was something deeper than power. It was presence. And presence would become the core of the samurai path. The training of a young samurai began not with the sword, but with the spine. He was taught to sit straight before he could read, to bow deeply before he could speak. Discipline was not imposed through fear, but through rhythm. The same task, done the same way, every morning, every evening. The child learned that repetition was not a punishment. It was preparation. The home itself became the first dojo. The way rice was served, the shoes arranged, the scrolls unrolled, all were lessons in precision. His mother taught silence, his father taught stance, his elders taught him the value of stillness, when to speak, when not to, when to yield, when to remain rooted, even as the winds of conflict pressed against the house. Before the boy could lift a real blade, he practiced with wooden ones, not to simulate combat, but to practice presence. His master would correct his grip, his breath, his posture, never with anger, always with clarity. Every mistake was a chance to return to the stance, to the breath, to the moment. And when the real blade was finally placed in his hands, it came with a bow, a ritual, a vow. The sword was not a toy. It was not even a tool. It was an extension of everything he had become, and a reflection of what he still needed to master. Samurai swords were passed down through generations. The steel carried not only sharpness, but story. You could feel the lives it had moved through. The father who held it in defense of his village. The grandfather who presented it at a peace offering. The uncle who carried it to the capital and never returned. Each samurai knew that his sword carried more than death. It carried memory. To draw it was to wake those memories. To sheath it was to honor them. And so, combat was never casual. It was a last resort. Because a true samurai won first with presence, with his bearing, with his clarity. Most conflicts were resolved before the sword ever left its scabbard. Because the real war was never outside. It was inside. With ego, with fear, with forgetfulness. And only those who mastered that war were ready for the field. In the centuries that followed, samurai became more than individuals. They became living extensions of their clan. Each family line carried its own legend, and the samurai became both the sword and the scroll of that legacy. His actions reflected on his ancestors. His honor was not personal, it was ancestral. Every step he took was weighted by the steps taken before him. Clan loyalty was sacred. A samurai would abandon wealth, safety, even reason, to uphold the name of his house. His armor bore the mon, the family crest, not as decoration, but as declaration. In battle, banners waved high above the fray, not to intimidate, but to remind. We are here. We stand for something. We do not move alone. Armor was a ceremony unto itself. Lacquered plates carefully tied with silk cords. Helmets adorned with horns, moons, crests, each chosen not for vanity, but for symbolism. Even the color of the cords carried meaning. The weight of the armor was part of the lesson. Movement required intention. The body became a temple of memory. Every creak, every pull of fabric echoed the steps of those who had marched before. Before battle, there were rituals, moments of stillness, offerings at a shrine, words written in case they became the last. Many samurai composed short death poems before donning armor, not out of morbidity, but clarity. To enter battle having already let go of life meant one could act without fear. It meant the mind was steady. The sword could follow. Battles in the early samurai era were not chaotic charges. They were orchestrated expressions of loyalty, precision, and form. Messages were passed on horseback, orders delivered by fan signal. Duels occurred not for spectacle, but to resolve disputes without bloodshed on both sides. the outcome of a single clash could preserve dozens of lives. But even when death came, it was not the greatest fear. The true dishonor was to live without the code, to forsake loyalty, to act in cowardice, to place self above all. These were the stains that no victory could cleanse. And so, every battle became a reflection, not just of strategy, but of self. And through these centuries of struggle, the samurai were tempered not just in fire, but in meaning. During the Kamakura period, the samurai class rose not only in number, but in structure. This was the birth of a new governance model, military in nature, spiritual in tone. The shogunate replaced the emperor's court as the source of real power, and with it, the samurai became both sword and seal. Lands were granted to warriors in exchange for service. Loyalty was not just personal, it was political. For many, their sword was their title, their actions were their resume, their silence, their signature. Hierarchies emerged. The daimyo held broad domains and responsibilities, commanding smaller lords beneath them. Below them were the foot soldiers, the ashigaru. But it was the samurai, bound between those worlds, who upheld the most complex balance. Warrior and official, poet and executor, enforcer and student. They became the scaffolding of the new order. Temples aligned with clans. Monks served as advisors. War and philosophy were no longer separate paths. They were two lanes of the same road. And as Zen Buddhism found its way into the hearts of the warrior elite, something subtle changed. The sword became less about action and more about awareness. The Zen influence reshaped training. Lessons were not only physical, but spiritual. A young samurai might spend a morning in combat drills and an afternoon in zazen meditation. He would learn to draw his blade in a single fluid motion, and then spend an hour observing a leaf fall in silence. This was not contradiction, it was balance. The samurai did not separate the practical from the poetic. He integrated them. His duty was not to fight blindly, but to fight wisely, to understand suffering, impermanence, stillness, consequence. Even his dreams were shaped by this lens. The goal was not conquest, it was clarity. The true samurai did not rush to battle. He walked toward it as he walked toward a garden, fully aware, fully awake. And when battle ceased and the armor was stored, the practice continued. In family life, in governance, in how documents were written, in how meals were served, in how apologies were delivered. Because once the code entered the bones, everything became part of the path. By the time the Sengoku period began in the mid-15th century, Japan was no longer unified. The country fractured into dozens of feuding territories, each led by ambitious warlords vying for power. These were decades of fire and betrayal. Castles rose and fell within lifetimes. Alliances shifted with the seasons. And in the heart of it all, the samurai endured. They were no longer just defenders, they were architects of fate. Their swords decided who would govern a province, who would hold a mountain pass, who would survive the winter. But amid this chaos, the samurai did not become barbaric. They became refined. They carried their traditions into the smoke. Even in bloodshed, they wrote poetry. Even in sieges, they brewed tea. They followed rituals before duels. They bowed before battle. Because to lose form in the face of fear was to lose more than life. It was to lose one's path. Some became generals, commanding armies with banners stretching across valleys. Others served quietly, guarding a single bridge, a single air, a single truth. But all were shaped by the same tension: how to hold order in disorder, how to carry discipline through disaster. It was during this time that the samurai began to lean more heavily on each other, not just as fighters, but as reminders of the code, of restraint, of dignity. A single bow across a battlefield could hold more meaning than 1,000 cries. A sword returned to its scabbard could say more than a strike. The chaos of war also gave rise to innovation, new strategies, new armor, even the introduction of firearms. Yet the spirit remained unchanged. A musket may have replaced a bow, but the way one held it, the posture, the focus, the presence, was still born of Bushidō. This was perhaps the most defining trait of the samurai across time: adaptability without erosion. They evolved with history, but did not dissolve into it. The world changed around them, but they carried the signal forward. And through all the ash, the tea still steamed, and the code still whispered. It was Oda Nobunaga who began the process of unifying the fractured land. His tactics were ruthless, his reforms sweeping. He broke the power of Buddhist warrior monks. He embraced the gunpowder weapon. He dismissed outdated traditions. But he did not abandon the samurai. He reshaped them. He demanded results, not ritual, precision, not poetry. In his armies, samurai no longer fought as isolated heroes. They moved in formations, acted as one, followed the rhythm of strategy. And yet, the spirit of Bushidō remained. Nobunaga demanded loyalty, clarity, swift execution of duty. The form evolved, the code endured. His successor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, continued the work. Though born a peasant, he rose through merit, a signal that the samurai path was no longer bound only by blood. Hideyoshi solidified class distinctions, freezing social mobility to stabilize the nation. Samurai were expected to live in towns, not on farmlands. They became bureaucrats, enforcers, tax collectors. Their swords still hung at their sides, but increasingly, their power came through paper. And then came Tokugawa Ieyasu. With his victory at the Battle of Sekigahara, the samurai era entered a new phase. Japan was finally unified under the Tokugawa shogunate. The wars were over. The swords were quiet. But the presence of the samurai remained strong. For 250 years of peace, they held the spine of the nation. Their role shifted again. They became administrators, philosophers, historians, poets. They kept the order of towns, enforced the laws of provinces, walked the same roads each day, nodding to shopkeepers, visiting temples, teaching their sons to hold the brush and the blade with equal care. Some struggled with this shift. Without war, their purpose felt blurred. Others found deeper meaning in the quiet, in ritual, in refinement. They began to master the invisible forms: the bow before entering a room, the silence after delivering a ruling, the stillness with which they drank tea. What war had once demanded of the body, peace now demanded of the mind. And in this stillness, the samurai did not fade. They evolved again. The Edo period became the long breath after centuries of storm. The land was still. Roads were safe. The castle walls no longer echoed with alarm bells. For the first time in generations, the samurai faced a new challenge. Not war, but time. In this silence, they found new ways to express the code. They became instructors in discipline, models of etiquette, and vessels of tradition. Swordsmanship was still practiced, but as a form of internal refinement. The cut of the blade became the cut of thought, sharp, intentional, and clean. Many samurai turned to literature. They wrote essays on governance, letters to their children, treatises on honor. They debated ethics in quiet tea rooms. They argued the meaning of courage not in blood, but in ink. Some ran schools. Others advised local magistrates. A few became poets, scribes, or archivists. Their homes became centers of learning. Their libraries, maps of thought. Their routines were structured with monastic care. Walk, read, instruct, reflect. The rituals of dress, of greeting, of letter writing, all became ways to carry precision into every hour. Their swords, while rarely drawn, remained polished. They were symbols, not threats, reminders, not weapons. The children of these samurai grew up in a world where combat was mythic. They heard stories, yes, but they also watched their fathers live a different kind of war. A war against decay, against forgetfulness, against drift. It was during this time that the code began to be formally written, not just remembered, not just taught in gesture, but etched into paper, preserved across scrolls and texts. Bushidō, once invisible, became visible. And yet, even as it was written, its spirit remained the same. It was not a doctrine to be recited. It was a way to walk. And the samurai, warrior turned statesman, duelist turned teacher, walked it still, step by measured step, long after the world had stopped asking them to. In the quiet hallways of Edo-era samurai homes, everything had a rhythm. Tatami mats were walked on with deliberate steps. The sliding of a shoji door was done with care, not haste. Even the way a scroll was unrolled or a cup of tea was passed carried the imprint of centuries. Discipline was taught in silence as much as in instruction. A child knew when to speak by watching his father's breath. He learned humility by how his mother accepted a guest. The brush was held with the same reverence as the blade, because both required stillness of hand and clarity of mind. Meals were rituals. Clothing was folded with grace. The home itself became a kind of dojo, not for combat, but for conduct. Every room echoed with the unspoken expectation: live the code. Boys learned to memorize not only passages of philosophy, but movements. How to bow, how to kneel, how to stand in a way that said, "I am ready." These were not rehearsals for war. They were preparations for life. And girls, though often hidden from battle, were no less vital. They upheld the moral architecture of the household. They knew the lineage, the stories, the meanings of symbols carved into heirloom blades. They taught songs to children, whispered histories, watched over the rituals of each passing season. Some trained in the naginata. Others mastered the art of political correspondence. All were guardians in their own way. The samurai class was more than a military elite. It was a cultural vessel. It carried forward etiquette, education, aesthetics, memory. Its members understood that what they preserved mattered just as much as what they could destroy. And so, even in an age without enemies, they remained warriors. Warriors of precision, of poise, of presence. And in the way they sat beside the hearth or tied their sandals, the echoes of 1,000 battles lived on. Not in sound, not in smoke, but in the stillness that only comes after fire. Not every samurai thrived in peace. For some, the absence of conflict was not a gift, it was a wound. They had trained for war. They had prepared their entire lives to meet death with grace. And now, with no battlefield to face, they turned inward. This was the quiet tension of the Edo period. Outward calm, inward questioning. Many samurai dealt with this shift by deepening their spiritual practices. They studied the teachings of Zen more intensely. They meditated not just to clear the mind, but to examine it, to understand the root of their ambition, their fear, their hunger for recognition. Others found refuge in beauty. They took up the brush and painted landscapes filled with fog and emptiness. They wrote poems about the sound of snow on a wooden roof. They cultivated gardens designed not to impress, but to humble. And still others fell into drinking, into gambling, into despair. Because to live by a code when the world no longer demands it is a particular kind of suffering. It requires not only discipline, but faith. Faith that the path still matters, that honor still exists even when no one is watching. That stillness is not surrender, but strength. Some left their swords on family altars and became monks. Others became teachers, mentors, watchers at temple gates. Their battles were now fought in the eyes of students, in the pull of ego, in the patience required to hold silence during a conversation where one knows they are right. This was the great shift, from external battle to internal mastery. And in many ways, it was harder. Because in war, the consequences are clear. In peace, the danger is forgetting. And the samurai, even as the decades wore on, did not forget. They kept the scrolls dry, the swords clean, the rituals alive. They walked slowly through the city, carrying nothing in their hands but the weight of a lineage. And in that posture, in that pace, there was power. The final years of a samurai's life were not always spent in battle or at court. Many retired to smaller homes or temple grounds. They tended gardens, they copied scrolls, they instructed a few close students, and they prepared, slowly and with care, for the act of dying. To the samurai, death was not an end, it was a mirror. How one died reflected how one had lived. A clean death was not simply free from scandal or error. It was full of clarity. It was a final act of alignment between the inner world and the outer form. Some wrote death poems. Others gave away prized blades to apprentices. A few simply sat quietly, their breath slowing in time with the falling leaves outside. But none of them let the code slip. Even when hands shook, even when memory faded, even when the world had changed so much that their walk no longer matched its rhythm, they carried the form. Because form was not a performance. It was a path. It held them steady. It reminded them, even in fragility, who they were. And so, the samurai passed, quietly, often without ceremony, but always with posture. And when they were gone, something strange happened. They became more than men. They became archetypes, stories, signals. The child who knelt beside the fire and heard the tale of a great duel did not remember every date or name, but he remembered the pause before the strike, the grace after the bow, the discipline that echoed even in defeat. The samurai became a map, not to war, but to selfhood, a symbol of what it meant to live for something beyond comfort, beyond gain, beyond self. And in this way, they did not vanish. They scattered into memory, into mannerism, into myth. and through those who remembered, who still bowed before entering, who still walked with purpose, the signal endured, quiet but unbroken. Even as modernity crept across Japan, through steamships and telegraphs, through rail lines and foreign boots, the image of the samurai remained. Children still bowed at the start of their lessons. Apprentices still cleaned their tools with reverence. And in households where swords were no longer worn, they still hung above the family altar, quiet reminders of a rhythm once lived. What was once necessity had become memory. What was once class had become culture. The samurai path no longer required armor or blood, but it still required form. And form, passed down correctly, becomes signal. A grandson learning to write kanji with upright posture. A granddaughter setting teacups in a careful circle. A bow shared between two elders before parting ways. These are not relics. They are continuations. The code had entered the nation's marrow. And though the laws changed, though swords were outlawed and titles dissolved, the path remained. In subtle ways, in posture, in tone, in how one listens fully, or waits before speaking, or chooses clarity over noise. Bushidō had never needed armor. It needed only attention. And so the signal passed, not loudly, but completely, from teacher to student, from parent to child, from craftsman to apprentice, not in lectures, in gesture. And through those gestures, the samurai origin continued, not in steel, but in stillness, not in legend, but in life. You can still feel them if you know where to look. In the pause before a call is answered, in the way a craftsman sharpens his chisel, in the sweep of a floor before guests arrive. Not grand gestures, but small, silent echoes. The samurai live there, not in monuments, not in museums, but in movement, in the unspoken care someone brings to a task, in the presence behind a promise, in the breath someone takes before doing something difficult and doing it anyway. That's where the code still breathes, because it was never about war. It was about clarity. To know the samurai is not to memorize names or dates. It is to recognize the shape of discipline, to feel the weight of devotion, to walk differently, to act with intention even when no one is watching. And that presence, that rhythm of life lived deliberately, is the final legacy. Not the armor, not the swords, but the invisible thread they left behind. A thread made of posture, of ritual, of restraint. It runs through Japan still, through families, through streets, through ink and silence and form. And when the wind moves just right, and a door slides open with care, and someone bows with no one there to see, it moves again. The samurai, the signal, still walking. To understand the samurai is not merely to study their history, but to study the invisible architecture of how they lived, moved, and saw the world. By the time the wars began to fade and the swords grew quiet, what remained was not just the image of a warrior, but the imprint of a code. Bushidō, the way of the warrior. Though the term would not be codified until much later, its essence lived in the daily rhythm of the samurai long before it was named. It was never a single document. It was not a creed to be memorized, but a way to be inhabited. And while it would eventually be written in ink, It was first lived in silence. Bushido was born in the spaces between action and stillness, in the choices no one saw, in the tone of a voice, in the way a scroll was rolled. It was a lens, a posture, a devotion, not to war, but to integrity. Its core tenets emerged slowly, shaped by generations of practice and refinement. Loyalty was central, not blind loyalty, but chosen loyalty, an active, conscious bond between samurai and lord, rooted in shared values. Courage was its sibling, not the reckless charge into danger, but the willingness to act rightly, even when no one watched. Compassion was not weakness, it was strength refined. A samurai was expected to be a guardian, not a tyrant. Courtesy was not about flattery, it was about restraint. A man who could kill but chose to bow was a man who understood the weight of life. Honesty, too, held a special place. Words mattered. Promises were not casual. One's name was one's currency, and every broken vow was a fracture in the mirror of the self. And at the heart of it all was honor, not as appearance, but as alignment between intention and action. This was Bushidō, not a performance, but a path. And as Japan entered longer periods of peace, this code became even more visible. With fewer battles to fight, character itself became the new terrain. The samurai who once honed blades now honed speech. They practiced clarity. They embodied structure. They made integrity visible. They did not talk about Bushidō. They became it. A typical day for a samurai during the height of the Edo period revealed just how deeply Bushidō had become embedded in behavior. There was no separation between the mundane and the meaningful. The way one rose from the floor, how one tied a sash, the sequence of opening sliding doors. Each act was a quiet ritual of presence. Samurai homes reflected the code they lived by: clean lines, empty space, deliberate structure. Tatami mats guided where to stand, where to kneel. Alcoves held seasonal scrolls or symbolic arrangements of flowers, not to decorate, but to remind. Even in domestic life, there was form. Even in stillness, there was shape. Training did not stop in times of peace. Sword forms were practiced with wooden blades in garden courtyards. Archery was approached not as sport, but as a discipline of breath and spine. Katas were rehearsed until motion and intention fused. These movements were not for performance. They were a kind of moving meditation, a prayer in motion. And alongside these physical disciplines came the cultivation of inner life. Reading was a daily practice. So was writing. A samurai was expected to not only master the art of war, but to understand the world he served. Many read Buddhist texts. Others studied Confucian classics or Chinese military strategy. Some wrote poetry, not to be published, but to test the refinement of their mind. Compassion, too, was tested daily, not in grand acts, but in the subtleties of leadership. How a samurai treated his servants, how he addressed elders, whether he acknowledged a farmer's gift with humility or entitlement. These choices mattered. They were the living grammar of the code. Honor was not about the past. It was about the next step, the next gesture, the next moment of silence. And this vigilance wasn't paranoia. It was commitment, a devotion to inner and outer harmony. To be samurai was not to float above the world, but to be fully present in it, attuned, aware, accountable. Bushidō offered no escape. It was a lens of responsibility, and through it, The samurai shaped not only themselves, but the entire atmosphere of Japanese society. Bushido also influenced how justice was perceived and delivered. For the samurai, law was not merely a tool for control, it was a mirror of one's internal order. To render judgment was not about exercising authority, but about preserving harmony. Samurai lords, overseeing towns and rural regions, often held court in austere chambers. No theatrics, no raised voices. Disputes were heard in full. Silence was part of the process. The goal was not punishment, but restoration of balance. A broken agreement required acknowledgement. A lie, when uncovered, was not just a breach of truth, it was a wound in the fabric of society. To speak falsely was to degrade one's name, and by extension, one's house. In this world, an apology could carry more weight than a duel. The bow, the posture of remorse, the stillness after a confession, these were seen as brave. Honor was measured not only by strength, but by the willingness to admit fault. Redemption was possible, but only through sincerity, not gestures, not words, but lived humility. This sense of order extended to the household. Children were raised not with indulgence, but with clarity. Respect for parents was absolute, but not fear-based. It was founded on example. The father rose before dawn. The mother maintained the hearth. Meals were taken as family, in silence or soft conversation. Stories were told of ancestors, not for pride, but for instruction. Even the arrangement of space reinforced the values of Bushido. Rooms were not cluttered. Items were stored carefully. Everything had its place. Order outside encouraged order within. The child who kept his sandals aligned would later align his thoughts in the same way. And so, discipline began in the body and moved into the spirit. Aesthetics too were shaped by the warrior's code. The samurai embraced wabi-sabi, a reverence for the imperfect, the impermanent, and the incomplete. They saw beauty in weathered wood, in chipped ceramics, in falling leaves. Perfection was not the goal. Presence was. And presence could only exist when one accepted the fleeting nature of all things. This philosophy infused every aspect of their lives. A calligraphy scroll was not judged only by its brushwork, but by the clarity of its intent. A garden was not meant to dazzle, but to calm. Even the sword, so often associated with death, was shaped with such grace that it resembled a piece of art more than a weapon. And in this blending of utility and beauty, the samurai revealed their truest form. Language, like action, was distilled. Samurai spoke little. Their words were precise, often poetic, sometimes indirect. Not to evade, but to honor nuance, to give the other person room to interpret, to consider, to reflect. Silence was not awkwardness. It was opportunity. A space in which truth could echo. This restraint extended into their thoughts on mortality. The samurai did not fear death. They rehearsed it. They accepted it as companion, not enemy. Each day could be the last. Each gesture could be final. And so, each act was treated with care. It was this ever-present awareness of death that made them so fully alive. Mentorship was another sacred expression of the code. Young samurai were not simply trained, they were shaped. Older warriors served not just as instructors of technique, but as guardians of conduct. They led not by orders, but by consistency. A student learned more from observing his teacher's stillness than from 1,000 lectures. The lessons came in subtle forms. How one answered a summons, how one held the sword while walking through a gate, how one folded a robe at day's end. These were not details, they were declarations. They revealed how deeply the code had been internalized. Apprentices lived with their masters, sharing meals, chores, and moments of silence. Correction came not through shouting, but through presence. A disapproving glance, a delayed answer. The apprentice would notice, adjust, refine, and slowly, posture became behavior. Behavior became character. Samurai did not only train warriors, they trained statesmen, diplomats, judges, artists, because Bushido was not about war, it was about orientation, and that orientation shaped not only conflict, but culture. Tea ceremony was perhaps one of the most profound expressions of Bushido's spirit. On the surface, it was simple. A quiet gathering, a cup of green tea, a few measured gestures. But beneath its formality lived a vast reservoir of meaning. Everything was intentional. The temperature of the water, the angle of the bow, the way the tea bowl was rotated before drinking. These were not habits, they were expressions of presence. To serve tea was to serve dignity. To receive it was to honor silence. Many samurai practiced tea not as an escape, but as a mirror. Within its stillness, they found their edge. The slow, practiced rhythm of the ceremony reminded them that control over one's breath was just as vital as control over one's sword, and perhaps more difficult. It was often said that Bushido could not be explained, only demonstrated. This was not humility, it was warning. The code did not live in scrolls. It lived in the way someone returned a borrowed tool, in the quiet of a corrected mistake, in how a samurai gave directions to someone who did not understand. Because character was not shown in crisis, it was shown in repetition. This was why even the smallest details were treated with reverence. The way a robe was folded, the way a gate was passed through, the exact moment one should bow, and how deeply. Not because the act itself was sacred, but because attention was. Bushido was not meant to make the samurai invincible. It was meant to make them worthy, worthy of respect, worthy of the role they carried, worthy of the sword at their hip. This distinction mattered deeply. The samurai did not pursue strength as a means of domination. They pursued strength as a vessel of integrity. The blade was a tool, yes, but also a burden. Its presence required stillness. Its edge demanded humility. The more skilled the warrior, the more gently he moved. And so, the training ground was never a place of noise. It was a place of listening, to the body, to the wind, to the moment before the strike. Some masters taught that a fight should never begin, that if you walked with clarity, you would disarm situations before they escalated. Others believed the best warrior was the one who never needed to draw. And many students, over time, came to see that the real enemy was never the opponent in front of them. It was the ego within. This was the deep lesson of Bushido, that strength without honor is a threat, and honor without strength is fragile. The samurai walked the edge between the two, not perfectly, not always gracefully, but deliberately. They understood that legacy is not built by victories, but by conduct, not by being remembered, but by being emulated. And so, they watched their tone, their timing, their presence in silence, because they knew that people were always watching. The villagers, the apprentices, the children sitting quietly near the garden steps, all of them learning, not from speeches, but from example. And the greatest power of the samurai was not in how they fought, but in how they stood. Trust was the true currency of a samurai's life, not gold, not titles, but the steady reliability of one's presence. A samurai was trusted to act without needing to be watched, to deliver truth even when it hurt, to make choices not for popularity, but for principle. This trust began within. A samurai had to trust his own judgment, his own restraint, his own ability to listen without rushing, to act without delay. That internal calibration, refined through years of form, reflection, and discipline, was the core of his reliability, because in every exchange, what was really being exchanged was presence. Bushidō taught that the body is always speaking, the way one enters a room, the way one picks up a tool, the way one responds to confusion or praise. These were all declarations of character, and a samurai understood this. He moved with the awareness that every action confirmed or contradicted the code. And so, he practiced, not just with weapons, but with tone, with posture, with the timing of his words. He refined the art of seeing what was meant, not just what was said, what was behind the anger, beneath the silence. This attunement made him more than a fighter. It made him a presence others could lean into, even in uncertainty, because in times of tension, people do not seek answers. They seek steadiness. And the samurai, by virtue of his training, became that steadiness. Not perfect, not infallible, but consistent, intentional. And that is why the code endured. Because it wasn't enforced. It was embodied. The influence of the code extended far beyond the warrior class. Townspeople modeled their shops on samurai values: clean, orderly, respectful. Farmers adopted their punctuality. Artisans echoed their discipline. Even entertainers mirrored the poise and restraint that defined a samurai's bearing. This transmission was not orchestrated. It was absorbed. A samurai walking through the marketplace didn't need to speak. His presence adjusted the energy around him, not out of fear, but out of calibration. People stood a little straighter. Voices softened. The rhythm shifted. Because the code, once embodied, made itself known without announcement. This quiet authority gave the samurai not just power, but responsibility. He could not slump. He could not snap. He could not excuse laziness or gossip or indulgence. He was the signal, and if the signal wavered, so did the integrity of those watching. That weight was not a burden. It was a reminder. The samurai was not elevated above the people. He was accountable to them. And through this accountability, the community itself found cohesion. Even children sensed it. They mimicked the way a samurai stood, the way he listened, the way he bowed, not too fast, not too shallow, because bowing, like breathing, carried intent, and intent, once practiced enough, became character. In this way, Bushidō did not stay confined to the sword belt. It entered kitchens, workshops, storytellers' corners. It shaped how teachers paused between sentences, how mothers instructed with patience, how a neighbor returned a borrowed item with both hands. And that is how a code becomes a culture, not through edict, but through example. Bushidō was not a shield from suffering. It was a way through it. When a samurai lost a loved one, or suffered failure, or watched a friend fall in battle, he did not collapse. He bowed. He breathed. He returned to form, not to suppress emotion, but to carry it with honor. Grief was not hidden. It was held. A samurai might write poetry in mourning, or sit beneath a tree for hours, or visit the ancestral shrine not for answers, but for alignment. In those moments, the code guided him, not to dismiss pain, but to move through it without distortion. This ability to suffer with structure became one of the deepest gifts of Bushidō. It taught emotional endurance. It offered a frame for storms. A samurai was allowed to hurt, but not to forget who he was. And in that remembering, there was healing. He did not chase distraction. He returned to ritual. He sharpened his blade. He swept the floor. He taught his students. He honored what he had lost, not by speaking of it endlessly, but by continuing with dignity. In this way, resilience was not heroic. It was habitual. The code reminded him, your presence matters, especially now. And so, a samurai facing grief became a mirror for others. People saw his steadiness and felt steadier themselves. They saw his posture in sorrow and remembered that composure is not denial. It is devotion to something larger than the moment. That something was the path. And the path never asked for perfection, only return. In the final centuries of the samurai era, the most important task became not war, but transmission. The passing of the code from one generation to the next was no longer done through armor or rank, but through presence. Fathers did not lecture their sons. They showed them. They showed them how to rise before the sun, how to kneel with stillness, how to speak only when speech was needed, how to bow even when no one bowed back. These were not rules, they were rhythms. And the children, even before they understood language, understood tone. They absorbed structure. They watched how elders moved, how they handled failure, how they served tea or offered correction. The code was never forced. It was modeled. And so it stayed alive. As Japan modernized, opening its ports, building railways, rewriting its laws, the samurai path began to dissolve from public role into private ritual. Swords were banned, titles were stripped, but the form remained. Because the code had never depended on circumstance, it depended on behavior. A man could still carry himself like a samurai in a merchant's robe. A teacher could bow like a warrior before entering a classroom. A mother could wrap her child's lunch with the same care once given to binding armor. Bushidō had moved beneath the surface. It had become water, clear, unassuming, essential. And though fewer and fewer called themselves samurai, the energy did not vanish. It flowed into how people held eye contact, how they honored silence, how they fulfilled a promise even when no one was watching. This was the quiet continuation of the path, not in title, in tone. As the Meiji era dawned and the formal samurai class was dissolved, many feared the code would vanish with them. But they misunderstood what had truly been created. The samurai had never been a political entity. They had been a psychological one. They had built not just systems of defense, but systems of attention. They had turned the body into a practice, the voice into a tool, the home into a temple. And those who watched, who learned in silence, carried that structure forward, even as Japan stepped into the modern world. The samurai remained behind the scenes, in how a teacher greeted their students, in how a craftsman laid his tools, in how a train conductor stood upright even when alone on the platform. That posture, that presence, was the unspoken continuation of Bushidō. The inner life of the samurai had always been the real battlefield, the place where ego was tested, where fear was acknowledged but not obeyed, where discipline became devotion, and that battlefield still existed, even in the absence of swords. Because every person still faces choice, to speak or remain silent, to act with haste or with honor, to forget or to remember. The samurai simply formalized that space, gave it shape, gave it name, and through their living offered a map. A map not to conquest, but to selfhood. And in that selfhood, Japan found more than warriors. It found mirrors. The presence of Bushidō in modern Japan is quiet, but unmistakable. You see it in the way a bow is held for 1 second longer than expected, in the care taken to wrap a package, in the silence before a formal apology. It lives in train stations, in classrooms, in kitchens, not because anyone calls it Bushidō, but because its essence endures. Clarity, discipline, respect, presence. Even in cities of steel and glass, where neon reflects off puddles and bullet trains pass like lightning, there are moments when time slows. A shopkeeper bows as you enter. A server places a cup before you with both hands. An elder folds their coat with deliberate care. These are not performances. They are practices, passed down not in words, but in witnessing, in absorption, in rhythm. The samurai are no longer visible, but their shadow stretches wide. Their discipline made its way into martial arts, into flower arrangement, into design, into how people wait in line, into how they walk through sacred spaces, even if they no longer believe. Because belief was never the requirement. Alignment was. And the samurai knew that. They did not demand loyalty. They embodied it. They did not advertise honor. They enacted it. And so their influence lingers, not as nostalgia, but as infrastructure. The internal blueprint of a people who once watched men walk with swords and now walk with poise. Because the real sword, the one that shaped Japan, was never the steel. It was the spine. And now the sword is quiet. But the posture remains. In offices where workers arrive early and bow to their desks. In schools where children stand when their teacher enters the room. In homes where slippers are aligned at the door and silence is held like a guest. It is the small things that carry the signal forward. No monument was needed. No statue cast. The samurai did not write their legacy in stone. They wrote it in muscle memory, in the pause before answering, in the steady hand that completes a task, even unseen, in the respectful return of a borrowed item, in the decision not to shame, even when one is right. This is the way of the warrior, still walking, and even though the armor is gone, and the laws have changed, and the world hums with machines, there is still a moment, in every day, in every city, when someone moves through the world with presence. And presence is the sword the world forgot it needed. The samurai knew this, and so they left us not swords, but signals. And the code, if you listen for it, still echoes in the quiet. To walk with presence is to remember what the samurai never forgot, that your life is your form, that every motion matters, that every choice echoes, that honor is not some dramatic test, but the tiny alignment between who you are and how you move through a room. You do not need a sword to live this way. You only need a breath, a pause, a willingness to return to what is true. Bushido was never about being perfect. It was about not drifting, about coming back, again and again, to stillness, to structure, to clarity. And that is the quiet inheritance. The samurai are gone, but the signal remains. In the way you fold your clothes, in how you answer the door, in the space you leave between moments, in the ritual of your morning, in how you carry yourself when no one is watching. That is the real armor now. And when you wear it, calmly, steadily, you are walking their path, not in costume, but in cadence. And the path, once walked with blades, now continues in breath. Bushido lives on, not because we remember the samurai, but because we still remember ourselves. And the remembering is enough. Every story of strength eventually meets the edge of change. For centuries, the samurai had been the backbone of Japan. Warriors turned leaders, poets turned teachers, swordsmen turned statesmen. But even the most disciplined tradition cannot escape the turning of history's wheel. By the mid-19th century, the world was pressing in. Steamships arrived in Edo Bay. Foreign diplomats stood in silk-lined rooms once reserved for samurai officials. The isolation that had preserved Japan's rhythm for over 200 years cracked open, and through that opening came a flood of questions. What did it mean to serve a lord in a world of constitutions? What was the role of a sword in the age of rifles and railroads? And could a warrior still be a warrior if there was no more war? The answers did not come easily. They came in tension, in resistance, in reluctant transformation. This is the story of that transformation, not only of policy and politics, but of identity, of a class born in fire, tested in silence, and finally asked to let go. It begins not with defeat, but with disruption. The first cracks appeared slowly, a shift in speech, a change in fashion. Foreign words began to appear in merchant scrolls. Western textiles arrived in ports and made their way into city wardrobes. Samurai, once distinguished by their layered robes and twin swords, found themselves indistinguishable from commoners in urban crowds. It was not just style that changed, it was purpose. The Tokugawa peace had given the samurai generations to refine their roles in administration and philosophy, but the Meiji Restoration of 1868 redefined the nation overnight. The emperor was restored as a figurehead, and a new central government, modelled on Western systems, began to dismantle the feudal domains. With it, the hereditary stipends that supported the samurai class were revoked. Some accepted this with grace, others with silent mourning, but many resisted, because what was being taken was not just income, it was meaning. The sword, once the soul of the samurai, was now outlawed in public. The top knot, another mark of distinction, was cut away. Titles faded, offices were abolished, lands were seized. and in the space left behind, confusion grew. Fathers who had trained their sons in the old ways now stood uncertain. Teachers who once lectured on honor now fielded questions about steam engines and foreign banks. A man who had once stood tall in a scroll-lined hall now waited at a train station, unsure of who he was without the structure that had shaped him. For the first time in centuries, the path was no longer clear. And for a people who had walked by code, that absence of direction felt like erasure. In every city and village, there were quiet reckonings. The man who had memorized the teachings of Yamaga Soko now found himself applying for clerical work. The warrior who had spent decades perfecting his form now wondered how to walk without his swords. Teacups still steamed, scrolls still hung, but the breath behind the rituals had changed. Some tried to preserve their rhythm. They taught calligraphy, opened martial arts schools, transcribed poetry by candlelight. Others wandered, became beggars, carried their dignity like a worn robe, and a few grew angry. Rebellion sparked. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a man who embodied both warrior virtue and political resistance, rose as the final cry of the old order. Thousands of former samurai marched, not just to reclaim power, but to defend the possibility that their way of life still had meaning. They carried swords against rifles, banners against cannons. Their defeat was inevitable, but their intent was not to win. It was to be seen, to make visible what was being lost in the name of progress. After the rebellion's failure, the samurai era was officially closed. The Meiji government moved quickly to westernize. A national military replaced the warrior caste. Conscription replaced lineage. Uniforms replaced robes. And yet, something deeper endured. Because though the rebellion ended in blood, the presence of the samurai did not vanish. It receded into memory, into manner, into the marrow of the nation, no longer visible, but never absent. With the fall of their institutions, the samurai did not vanish. They adapted. Some became civil servants, their sense of duty intact beneath Western uniforms. Others led schools, embedding discipline into new curricula. A few joined the industrial movement, managing factories with the same precision once given to sword drills. And many turned inward, becoming writers, painters, and monks, shaping the new soul of Japan through quiet mediums. The form had changed, but the presence remained. Samurai values reappeared in unlikely places, in railway timetables printed with absolute precision, in contracts honored with near-sacred seriousness, in classroom etiquette where teachers bowed before students, in craftsmen who sanded each edge until it reflected care. It was not nostalgia, it was continuity. The posture of the old warrior became the backbone of the new nation. Even business, the very thing once seen as vulgar by samurai, absorbed their influence. Executives began to speak of duty and loyalty, of the importance of long-term reputation over short-term gain. Company songs replaced clan oaths. Factories became new battlegrounds where resilience, structure, and attention determined survival. And so the code survived, not as doctrine, but as pattern, no longer named, but still recognized. In the calm of a craftsman's breath, in the stillness before a public speech, in the exactness of a meal served with both hands. Bushido had left the scrolls. It had entered the bloodstream. In the years that followed, artists and poets became the new historians of the samurai, not with facts, but with feeling. Woodblock prints captured final duels and moonlit meditations. Novels romanticized fallen warriors and secret oaths. The kabuki stage echoed with tragic heroes and quiet acts of loyalty. In these retellings, the samurai were no longer men. They were mirrors, reflections of who people wanted to be: disciplined, grounded, principled, unshaken. In a world racing toward modernity, the samurai became a memory of stillness, a reminder that strength did not always mean speed. Portraits appeared in homes, ancestors with top knots and steel eyes. Scrolls were unrolled on holidays. Children recited verses about courage, even if they no longer studied swordsmanship. The gestures endured: a bow, a pause, a certain way of receiving bad news with grace. These were not performances. They were inheritances. Passed not through law, but through tone. In the countryside, old blades were kept in wooden boxes wrapped in linen, not to be used, not to be shown, but to remind, to anchor, to keep the breath of the past moving through the present. Because Bushido was never just a code of conduct. It was a compass of being. And in that compass, even as times changed, people still found north. By the early 20th century, Bushido was no longer just a cultural memory. It was being studied, reinterpreted, and institutionalized. Writers like Nitobe Inazo gave the code new language. In his book, Bushidō, The Soul of Japan, he translated the unspoken ethics of samurai into terms the West could understand: loyalty, courage, courtesy, self-control. These were no longer warrior virtues. They were human ones. Schools adopted these principles into curricula. Teachers emphasized self-discipline, respect, and duty, not as relics, but as essentials. Children were taught to bow before speaking, to thank with both hands, to clean their classrooms as a form of community responsibility. These were not just behaviors. They were echoes of a rhythm older than textbooks. Even universities embraced the idea that the nation's strength came not from its weapons, but from the posture of its people. And as Japan rose in global influence, these ideas traveled. Business leaders referenced samurai texts in boardrooms. Athletes cited Bushido as a philosophy of focus. Artists used the samurai's silence as an antidote to modern noise. Even in political speeches, the vocabulary of the code lingered: duty, sacrifice, unity, form. It was not always precise, sometimes romanticized, sometimes distorted. But the signal was still there. The signal that to live with structure, even in freedom, is not oppression. It is a choice, a shape for the soul. Even in the modern era, surrounded by screens and skyscrapers, the spirit of the samurai lingers beneath the surface. In moments of decision, it surfaces, in how a mistake is owned without excuse, in how a student refuses to take shortcuts, in how a worker stays late not for praise, but because the job is not yet complete. These are not accidents. They are the muscle memory of a nation shaped by centuries of quiet structure. No one says Bushido out loud. It is not needed. It lives in tone, in rhythm, in how one shows up. A salaryman tying his necktie each morning with focus, a musician practicing scales at dawn, a janitor sweeping the station platform with the precision of a swordmaster. All of them are continuing a lineage, even if they do not name it. Because the samurai path was never about titles, it was about touch. How you touch your tools, how you touch time, how you touch the lives of others through presence. This is what lives on, not the wars, not the armor, but the cadence, the pause before action, the deep breath before speaking, the commitment to form, even when no one is watching. It's not about being perfect, it's about not drifting. And in that steadiness, quiet, grounded, invisible, the legacy remains. For many, the question never left. Who am I if I am not what I was trained to be? This was the quiet grief of transformation, not loud, not dramatic, but constant. A low hum beneath the surface of everyday life. For those descended from warriors, the absence of war created a longing not for violence, but for clarity. The samurai had lived with such sharpness. Every movement mattered. Every choice echoed. And now, in a softer world, the edges blurred. Some searched for that clarity in meditation. Others found it in craft. A few became teachers of martial arts, not to preserve combat, but to preserve cadence. The bow before entering the dojo, the moment of stillness before movement. These were not relics. They were rituals of remembrance. Because at the heart of the samurai was not a sword, but a signal. A way of holding oneself, of responding instead of reacting, of choosing form even in fatigue. This did not need a battlefield, it needed breath. And so the transformation did not mean the end of the code, it meant its diffusion. Into studios, into classrooms, into kitchens and courtrooms, into how someone prepared for a difficult conversation, into how they carried themselves through heartbreak, into how they stood, soft but unshaken, in the face of chaos. This is where the samurai still live, not in armor, but in alignment. Today, the modern warrior does not wear armor. She may wear a stethoscope, he may hold a mop. They may carry nothing but a notebook and a fierce devotion to something unseen. But the posture is the same. You see it in the way a nurse moves through a crowded hallway, steady even when overwhelmed. In how a father shows up to work after a sleepless night, not for praise, but because someone is counting on him. In how an artist continues refining a piece no one will ever see, because excellence is its own reward. These are not gestures of glory, they are expressions of code. The samurai knew that the world may never applaud integrity, but that did not make it optional. They moved with presence because it shaped who they were. And now, in modern cities and quiet homes, that same presence can still be found. In the care with which food is prepared, in the silence held during an apology, in how someone holds their tongue, not out of fear, but out of form. Bushidō was never about victory. It was about visibility of the soul. And the soul, when lived cleanly, when acted out without announcement, becomes something others can stand beside. Not because it shines, but because it does not move. In many families, the title disappeared, but the tone remained. A child might grow up never hearing the word samurai, but they still noticed how their grandfather stood when speaking, how their grandmother kept every drawer in perfect order, how their father fixed what was broken before it was asked, how their mother handled hardship with dignity, never demanding thanks. These were not lessons in speech, they were embodied memory. And so, without knowing it, the rhythm was passed, in the way rice was washed, in the way silence was shared around a table, in the way shame was met not with collapse, but with quiet repair. This is how cultures survive, not only through institutions, but through breath, through watching someone return to their center after being knocked off balance, through learning that strength does not shout, that leadership does not require a stage, that discipline, practiced long enough, becomes grace. The samurai path was never just about the warrior, it was about the witness, and those who watched, who absorbed the shape of presence, carried it forward, sometimes diluted, sometimes distorted, but always alive. Because when form is repeated with care, it does not fade. It becomes something more. It becomes inheritance. There is something sacred in rhythm. The way a room is entered, the way a gift is given, the way a task is finished fully, even when no one will check. These patterns are not habits, they are inheritances. A man who keeps his shoes aligned each night is not performing, he is remembering. A woman who bows before asking a difficult question is not submitting, she is honoring. A craftsman who sharpens his tools at the same hour every day is not wasting time, he is practicing presence. And though none of them call themselves samurai, the spirit is unmistakable, because the samurai never asked to be remembered, they asked to be continued. And they are, in each deliberate gesture, in each moment of restraint, in every time someone chooses form instead of frenzy. That choice, that shaping of the moment, is the path. And that path, though invisible to the hurried, still shines beneath the surface of daily life, not through grand monuments, but through quiet rhythm, through the geometry of attention. The greatest transformation of the samurai was not in their disappearance, but in their diffusion. They did not end. They dissolved into presence. No longer marked by armor or rank, they became felt in how someone waits without fidgeting, in how someone corrects without humiliating, in how someone ends a day with care, even when exhausted. These are not lost arts. They are quiet arts, passed from breath to breath, without title, without ceremony. The samurai taught us that true mastery is not dominance, it is discernment, knowing when to speak, when to hold back, when to give your best to something small, simply because small things deserve it. That is what remains. The choice to show up fully, to fold the napkin, to return the pen, to clean the blade, even if it is now a kitchen knife or a paintbrush or a spreadsheet. This too is the way, and those who walk it, whether they know it or not, are continuing the line, not of warriors, but of witnesses. Witnesses to what it means to live with rhythm, with clarity, with form that sharpens the soul. This is the true legacy, not what was lost, but what was kept. What endures is not the image, but the imprint. The samurai are no longer visible. Their robes have been folded. their swords sheathed for the last time, but what they shaped in silence remains. In the way someone meets uncertainty with calm, in the way someone returns to a task even after failure, in the way someone carries responsibility, not for attention, but because they said they would. This is not history, it is structure, alive in gestures, carried in breath. It doesn't matter that the names are forgotten. The names were never the point. The posture was, the return to form, the quiet courage to choose alignment over impulse. And in this way, the transformation was never a fall. It was a refinement, from rank to rhythm, from caste to character, from symbol to signal. And the signal, still alive, waits not to be worshipped, but to be remembered, to be walked again, not with swords, but with stillness. So now, when you sit quietly at the end of a long day, when you light a single candle, when you wash a dish without rushing, when you breathe before answering, when you put things away where they belong, know that you are not merely tidying a space, you are tending to a signal. The same one that moved through mountain trails and castle halls, that whispered behind every bough, that steadied hands in the dark before a duel, that remained, long after the battles, long after the robes, long after the swords had turned to ash. This is not nostalgia. This is a remembering. That form is not old. It is eternal. That discipline is not repression. It is reverence. That silence is not emptiness. It is structure. And the one who returns to that structure, who walks quietly, who holds attention like a thread, who chooses grace in ordinary things, is not performing tradition. They are living it, and in that quiet return, the samurai still walk. And when the world feels loud, and your thoughts move faster than your breath, pause, not to fix anything, just to return to your seat, to your task, to your own presence. Let your breath settle. Let your hands soften. Let your posture recall the memory your mind has forgotten. You are not separate from the line. It lives in you, not because of blood or name or costume, but because you carry rhythm, because you bow before you speak, because you finish what you start, because you hold things carefully, especially when they matter most. This is the quiet revolution, not to become someone else, but to become still, and in that stillness, to remember the signal, not as history, but as home. This is no longer a story of warriors. This is a story of memory, not the kind kept in books or monuments, but the kind folded into breath, the kind that lives beneath routines, in how you pour water, in how you answer a question, in the way you pause before speaking. The samurai are gone, but the signal remains. It is quieter now. No drums, no banners, no swords on hips, but it's still here, echoing in the small spaces of your day, waiting to be heard again. This final part of the journey is not about remembering the past. It's about remembering yourself. Because beneath the layers of your schedule, your habits, your tasks and obligations, there is something older, something still, something that does not rush. That is what they protected. Not just a nation, but a rhythm. And if you listen now, in the dark, in the quiet, in your own breath, you may feel it again. The signal, still walking, still here, still waiting to be reclaimed. There's a certain kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels full, full of memory, full of structure, full of a rhythm you didn't know you were part of, until you slowed down enough to hear it. This is the silence the samurai carried. Not a silence of fear or repression, but of choice, of form, of knowing when to speak and when not to, of honoring the space between things. You can feel that silence in the early hours before the city wakes, in the way light moves across a clean surface, in the deliberate folding of clothes, in the first sip of tea or coffee, when nothing is being said, but everything is being aligned. These are not moments of productivity. They are moments of return. Return to center. Return to breath. Return to the part of you that remembers how to move with presence, not to perform, not to impress, but because moving that way makes you feel real. There is no sword, there is no title, but there is posture. And posture, once aligned, carries memory that your mind forgot, but your body still remembers. You do not need to know the old names to walk the old path. It was never about the names. It was about rhythm, breath, the way someone touches the world without rushing, the way someone listens fully without needing to reply, the way someone finishes what they start, even when no one is watching. That was the real blade. Not the one worn on the hip, but the one forged in the heart. And you carry it now, not because you asked for it, but because the world needs it, needs someone who knows how to stand still when others rush, needs someone who can hear beneath the noise, needs someone who sharpens their integrity the way a swordsman sharpens steel, slowly, deliberately, without skipping steps. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to return, again and again, to the moment, to your breath, to the shape of your day, not as a trap, but as a form. Form is not control, it is care, and care, practiced daily, becomes character, just as it always has. Look at your day, not as a checklist, but as a ceremony. How you wake up, how you greet the first light, how you prepare your space. These are not chores. They are forms. The way you wash a dish, the way you close a door, the way you respond to someone's frustration, not with reaction, but with rootedness. This is your dojo now. No walls, no mats, no instructor with a stick. Just you, your choices, your alignment. Discipline is not punishment. It is presence practiced. And the more you return to it, the more stable you become. Not stiff, but stable. Not rigid, but real. Because presence softens what panic sharpens. It allows you to meet the moment without needing to conquer it. You become less concerned with being impressive and more devoted to being true. That is what the samurai discovered, and what you now remember, not in costume or imitation, but in how you handle the ordinary. Because how you do anything becomes who you are, and the shape of your day, repeated with care, becomes the structure of your soul. There is something sacred in repetition, not the kind that numbs, but the kind that refines. The way a blade is honed through hundreds of quiet strokes. The way a path is cleared by walking it again and again. The way your morning can become a form of prayer, not because you believe in something, but because you're paying attention. Attention is the modern sword, and your life is asking you to carry it. Not dramatically, not in rebellion, but in the smallest acts of care. The way you make your bed, the way you check in on someone without needing anything in return, the way you sit down to work, not for glory, but to keep a promise to yourself. This is the new warrior's path, one where battles are internal, where presence is the edge that cuts through chaos, where patience becomes a shield, where form is how you hold the line, and you are not alone in this. Every time you pause before acting, every time you return to breath, every time you choose intention over impulse, you walk beside them, the ones who came before, the ones who left no maps, only rhythm. The first battlefield was never out there. It was in the body. Long before the sword was drawn, the samurai trained their breath, their spine, their step. They understood that if the body was unstable, the mind would be loud, and if the mind was loud, clarity could not arise. So they practiced stillness. Stillness in movement, stillness in breath, stillness in chaos. And now, centuries later, you have the same invitation, not to control, but to calibrate. How you sit at your desk, how you walk through a doorway, how you hold your shoulders when you're unsure. These are not performances. They are positions of power, the quiet kind. Posture is not vanity, it is presence. The body aligned becomes a tuning fork for focus, a reminder to return, to soften the jaw, to relax the grip, to slow the breath. This is the real dojo now. Your own form, your own ability to steady when others rush, to listen when others speak, to breathe when tension rises. And every time you return to the body, you return to the signal, the one that walked through bamboo forests, that stood on temple steps, that moved with quiet hands, even in great storms. It's still here, waiting for you to slow down long enough to feel it. Discipline is not a cage. It is a doorway, not to less freedom, but to deeper freedom. The kind that isn't reactive, the kind that doesn't collapse when pressure arrives, the kind that knows who it is, without needing to prove it. That was always the purpose of the code. Not to restrict the samurai, but to shape them, to turn chaos into rhythm, reaction into response, movement into meaning. You feel this when you follow through on something difficult, when you hold a boundary with kindness, when you put the phone down and sit with yourself, even when it's uncomfortable. That is presence earned, and it builds something within you, a stillness that cannot be shaken by the mood of the moment, a quiet strength that holds its shape, even when no one is looking. This isn't about forcing yourself to be better. It's about remembering that you already carry the form. Discipline is not something to chase. It is something to return to. And the more you return, the more it stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like you. Because the real path was never about becoming anything. It was about coming back. Attention is the new blade, not sharp in the way steel cuts, but in the way it slices through noise, through confusion, through distraction. It reveals what matters. It gives weight to the moment. It brings breath back into the body. The old warriors trained for this, not just with weapons, but with awareness. Every step on gravel, every hand on a tea bowl, every breath on a cold morning. They practice noticing. They practice precision, not for show, but for alignment. And now, that same invitation reaches you, not with ceremony, but with choice, to bring attention to what you're doing, even when no one is watching, to bring breath into motion, to bring care into conversation, to walk like your presence changes the room, because it does. You don't need to meditate on a mountaintop. You just need to notice how you move, how you speak, how you hold yourself in tension. Attention, practiced daily, becomes a form of reverence. It says, I am here. I am awake. I am in rhythm with something deeper than urgency. And that rhythm is the inheritance. It is not in your blood. It is in your attention. And every time you return to it, you remember who you are. The old samurai wore armor of lacquer and steel. You wear yours in how you respond. Not in how you fight, but in how you stay. How you breathe through discomfort. How you remain kind when it would be easier to shut down. How you return to form when emotion pulls you sideways. This is the modern armor. It doesn't deflect arrows. It steadies the heart. It doesn't block blades. It keeps the hand open when the mind wants to close. And you build it the same way they did, through repetition, through ritual, through repair. You learn to stay with yourself, to sit in the silence after failure, to take the breath before reacting, to find the moment of softness beneath anger. And every time you do, you're forging something stronger than steel. You're building a presence no one can steal. The world doesn't often reward emotional grace, but that's why it matters, because someone has to carry the signal forward, not in stories, but in embodiment, not in legend, but in daily life. And that someone might be you, if you can remember the way back to center and choose to return again and again, even when it's hard. Ritual is not about what you do. It's about how you do it. The way you open a window in the morning, the way you wash your face, the way you sweep the floor, check your tools, close your day. These are not tasks to rush. They are shapes that shape you. The samurai knew this. Their rituals were precise, not to control, but to center. Every motion mattered. Every repetition reinforced presence. Not because someone was watching, but because they were. And now, centuries later, the form still stands, waiting to be filled again. Not with swords, with breath, with deliberate pauses, with full attention, with the decision to bring structure to your day, not to impress anyone, but to remember who you are. Because form, repeated enough, becomes character, and character, lived long enough, becomes culture. This is how the code survives, not in texts, in timing, in tone, in the silent ways you honor your life by living it like it matters, because it does. And when you move that way, even in the smallest tasks, you are not going through motions. You are becoming the motion itself. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what you repeat now, over and over again, in how you live, in the shape of your habits, in the way you carry tension or release it, in how you speak when you're tired, in how you treat the people who will never thank you. This is what becomes memory. Not the dramatic moments, the daily ones, the way you tie your shoes, the way you wait without fidgeting, the way you carry silence into the room instead of noise. That is the lineage, not the bloodline, the behavior. And when your children or friends or strangers observe how you hold your own life with care, they will remember, even if they never mention it, even if they never quite understand what they saw. They will remember that there is another way, a quieter way, a more rooted way, and that memory will live in them. Because rhythm travels, not through explanation, but through example. There is a kind of power that doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to win the argument. It doesn't need to correct, dominate, or rush to respond. It moves like water. It adjusts. It watches. It waits. This is the power of restraint, the kind the samurai trained for every day, not just in sparring, but in silence, in the way they received offense without retaliation, in the way they chose when not to act. Because power without discipline is noise, but power with form is presence. You can feel it in someone who doesn't interrupt, in someone who listens fully, in someone who lets emotion move through them, but doesn't let it drive the next word. That's not suppression. That's structure. And it takes more strength to hold back than to lash out. You feel it in yourself too, when you breathe instead of bite, when you sit in discomfort without reaching for distraction, when you let someone speak, even when you disagree, and you stay open. That is the blade, turned inward, not to harm, to carve space, for clarity, for dignity, for the kind of groundedness that cannot be faked. And that too is Bushidō, not in armor, but in tone. Stillness is not absence, it is structure, a quiet kind of strength that doesn't waver when things get loud, a calmness that isn't passive, but deliberate, a choice to remain grounded, even as the world pulls at your attention. The samurai practiced this long before battle. They sat in silence. They watched the flame. They breathed into discomfort, not to avoid conflict, but to meet it cleanly. You can practice the same in traffic, in a tense conversation, in the pause before you reach for something out of habit. These moments, so small, so forgettable, are the ones that shape you, because when you meet stillness with attention, it begins to shape your rhythm. Your pace softens, your reactions slow, your words become fewer and more honest, and slowly the world begins to feel less like something to survive and more like something to move through with care. This is not about perfection, it's about presence. And presence is not found in ideas. It's found in stillness, lived, breathed, returned to. You don't need a sword. You don't need robes or rituals or scrolls. You just need to return to your life and live it like it matters. Because this is the dojo now, your hallway, your kitchen, the long pause before a difficult conversation, the way you clean the table at the end of the day, the moment you stop to listen, fully, with nothing in your hands. This is training, not for war, but for integrity, not to defeat anyone, but to remember yourself. And when you treat each moment like it's part of your path, something subtle changes. You become more deliberate, more present, more generous. You move like someone who's not chasing meaning, but creating it. Every task becomes a form. Every day becomes a kata, not perfectly executed, but sincerely offered. And in that sincerity, you become something stronger than consistent. You become aligned. And alignment, walked daily, becomes your signal. No one else needs to see it. You'll feel it in your spine, in your pace, in your peace. You're not becoming someone else. You are becoming someone true. Every time you pause instead of push, soften instead of shrink, hold presence instead of noise, you are not improving. You are remembering. The form is already in you. The rhythm is already waiting. The posture of integrity, the breath of patience, the cadence of someone who lives with quiet clarity. This is not about crafting an image. It's about listening beneath the image. Because your presence, when grounded, says everything without needing to explain. It creates space around others. It calms the room. It invites truth forward. And that's what this whole path has always been about. Not control, but coherence. Not performance, but peace. So stop chasing the next version of yourself. Start inhabiting the one who's already capable, already watching, already aligned with a deeper knowing. Presence is not a technique. It is your signal, undistorted. And every time you slow down enough to feel it, it grows stronger. Not everyone will understand how you move. They may question your silence, misread your restraint, assume your softness is weakness. Let them. The samurai didn't carry themselves for praise. They carried themselves for alignment. To live by rhythm, especially when others move by impulse, is to accept that you won't always be mirrored. But your posture is not a response to the world. It is a devotion to your own truth. This is the kind of clarity that doesn't shout. It just stays. It doesn't argue. It returns to the breath, to the structure, to the moment, again and again. And every time you do, the noise outside matters less. The confusion softens, the opinions fade, and what remains is something quieter, steadier, truer. Your signal, not for show, for self. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You just need to be clear. And that clarity is a practice. One step at a time, one breath at a time, one choice at a time. Rest is not the opposite of progress. It is part of the rhythm. The inhale before the strike, the pause before the reply, the silence between each step. The samurai understood this. Their lives were not all motion. They honored rest, stillness, recovery. They sat, they watched, they listened, because they knew that energy without direction is noise. And you feel this too. When you let yourself slow down, not to escape, but to return. When you give yourself permission to do nothing, and in that nothing, you begin to feel whole again. That is not laziness. That is rhythm. And it is in those quiet moments, when you're not performing or achieving, that your signal grows clearest. The deeper part of you re-emerges, the part that doesn't measure worth in output, the part that doesn't panic in stillness. It just breathes. Because breathing is enough. You don't have to earn this rhythm. You only have to let it catch up to you. And when it does, you'll remember. The signal doesn't arrive through effort. It arrives through alignment. And rest is where that alignment waits. Slowness is not a flaw. It is a kind of wisdom. To move slowly is to feel, to notice, to respond with care. And in a world addicted to urgency, that slowness becomes rebellion, quiet, grounded, and true. The samurai did not rush. They observed. They waited. They practiced every motion until it became honest. Not fast, honest. Because speed may impress. But form transforms. You can feel this when you walk slower on purpose. When you chew instead of swallow. When you leave space in a conversation. Not to win, but to connect. This is how you reawaken the signal. Not by reading more, but by rushing less. Because everything you need to remember already lives beneath the noise. The discipline, the rhythm, the alignment. They don't arrive in pressure. They return in pace. So slow down, not as retreat, but as return. And in that return, you will discover what the samurai always knew. that nothing real is built in haste, but everything true is built in rhythm. Movement becomes meditation when you do it with presence, not performance, not pressure, just presence. The way you walk down the hall, the way you fold a towel, the way you wash your hands or close the blinds or shut the lid of a jar. These are not meaningless motions. They are the shapes your attention lives inside. And when you bring care to those shapes, something ancient stirs. You begin to feel the weight of your own presence. You begin to remember that meaning doesn't arrive in thunder. It arrives in rhythm. That's how the signal returns, not in revelation, in repetition. The way the same brushstroke eventually becomes sacred. The way the same bow deepens each time. The way you begin to feel real again, not when something new happens, but when you return to something old with new attention. This is how the samurai trained, and this is how you remember, not by striving, but by showing up to the moment you're in and filling it fully, even if it's small, especially when it's small. At some point, the form stops being something you follow. It becomes something you are. You no longer bow because you were taught to. You bow because your body remembers reverence. You no longer sit with stillness because it's expected, but because it brings you home. You no longer repeat the task to prove anything, but because the repetition itself becomes a rhythm that carries you. This is the signal no longer studied. It is lived. And the more you live it, the less you need to explain. People feel it in your timing, in your gaze, in the way you do what you say you'll do, not once, but always. That becomes legacy, not the kind carved in stone, but the kind whispered between breaths, passed on not through ceremony, but through observation. Someone watches you move with care. They don't know why it stays with them, but it does. Because your presence left a mark, not a performance, a pattern, a shape they recognize again years later, in how they walk or speak or hold their own lives a little more gently. That's the legacy the samurai left. And now, maybe, you do too. The sacred isn't always where you expect it. It's not just in temples or scrolls or special rituals. It's in the ordinary things, done with extraordinary presence. The way you greet someone with full attention. The way you put something back where it belongs. The way you sit with someone in silence, not needing to fill the air. These are not small things. They are the architecture of legacy. Because most people won't remember your achievements. They'll remember your tone, your patience, the way you made them feel safe or seen or respected, even when they didn't deserve it. And that presence, that's where the old signal lives. It doesn't ask to be noticed. It asks to be real. And every time you choose to bring that presence into the mundane, into the hallway, the kitchen, the phone call, the commute, you become part of the lineage, the one that doesn't wear robes anymore, but still walks with rhythm, still lives with care, still bows before life, not out of duty, but out of devotion. When you slow down enough, time changes, minutes stretch, breath softens, awareness deepens. You begin to notice things you usually miss, the sound of your footsteps, the warmth of your hands, the way light lands across your table. These are not distractions. They are invitations, portals to presence, gateways to remembering. Because the world has always been this quiet. It's just that you were moving too fast to hear it. And once you do, something inside settles. You realize you don't need to chase meaning. You need to return to it. The meaning that lives in your cup of tea, in the doorway you pause at, in the choice to listen instead of talk. These are not accidents. They are signals, still pulsing beneath the noise of modern life, still waiting for someone, maybe you, to slow down long enough to notice. And in that noticing, the world becomes less of a blur. It becomes alive again, not through doing more, but through arriving more fully to what's already here. Presence doesn't live in your thoughts. It lives in your hands, in the way you touch your surroundings, in the way you move through a room, in the way your shoulders shift when you decide to return to yourself. This is where the signal becomes visible, not in ideas, but in posture. You feel it when you straighten without tension, when you clean the space around you as a reflection of the clarity within, when you step into your day like it has weight, because it does. Every doorway is a threshold, every movement, a message. You're telling your nervous system, I am here, I am safe, I am steady. And over time, that message rewires how you live. You stop rushing. You start noticing. You begin to feel the presence of something older than stress, deeper than distraction. That's what the samurai trained for, not perfection, presence. And now that presence moves through you, not to perform, but to remember that how you walk is part of how you live, and how you live is part of what you pass on. You are not your goals. You are your rhythm, the way you rise each day, the way you return to breath, the way you follow through, not when it's easy, but when it's boring, difficult, or unseen. This is where identity lives, not in achievement, in alignment. The samurai weren't shaped by war. They were shaped by how they lived between battles, how they bowed when no one watched, how they sharpened their blade even in times of peace, how they walked through the world like it was worthy of reverence. You can do the same by walking your life with care, not to become someone else, but to become more honest, less chasing, more choosing, less urgency, more rhythm, because the signal you carry doesn't respond to pressure. It responds to presence. And every time you stop chasing the next thing and return to this moment, this breath, this form, you are not falling behind. You are arriving right where you belong. Every choice is a form, not just a decision, but a declaration of who you are, of what matters, of where you stand when no one is looking. And the samurai knew this. They didn't just choose based on outcome, they chose based on alignment. Would this action reflect the code? Would it honor their word? Would it deepen integrity or fracture it? You can ask the same. Not just, what do I want? But, what would be aligned? Because alignment is what builds trust, not just with others, but with yourself. When your choices match your values, you stop carrying the weight of pretending. You feel lighter, clearer, grounded in something beyond mood or momentum. And this too is the signal, not in what you choose, but in how you choose, not with urgency, with attention, because even the smallest decision, how you speak, how you respond, how you end your day, can either distort your rhythm or deepen it. And when you begin to choose from rhythm, not reaction, your life becomes less about control and more about coherence. How you carry your day becomes how your day carries you. If you rush, the world feels rushed. If you return to rhythm, the world begins to slow. Not because the world changed, but because you did. And this is the heart of it. Ritual is not what you do, it's how you do it. When you brush your teeth with care, that's presence. When you wash the dishes without resentment, that's reverence. When you pause between tasks, even for one breath, and feel yourself return, that's the signal moving through you. This is the art of turning life into a dojo, not by changing what you do, but by changing how you meet it. And when that shift happens, when attention replaces obligation, your routines become rituals, your habits become alignment, your hours begin to hum with something deeper. Not performance, not pressure, but presence. And presence repeated becomes peace. Not because things are easy, but because you are steady. And steadiness, now more than ever, is sacred. Your presence doesn't just change you, it changes the room. People feel it in how you listen, in how you pause, in how you stay rooted even when emotions rise. They feel safer around you, less hurried, less judged, more human. You're not giving them advice, you're giving them rhythm, a signal that says, it's okay to slow down, it's okay to breathe, it's okay to be here fully. And this is how the old code travels, not through lectures, but through energy, through the tone of your voice, the steadiness of your eyes, the way you don't flinch when someone brings their fear to you, because you've met your own fear, and you've stayed. This is what presence does. It ripples, and that ripple becomes memory. Long after people forget your name, they'll remember how they felt around you, whether they felt heard, whether they felt rushed, whether they felt like they could take off the mask for a moment. This is the legacy of the signal, not in what you taught, in how you were, and how that presence softened the world, one room at a time. Your word is not just something you speak, it's something you carry. When the samurai gave their word, it was a vow, not because they feared punishment, but because they honored structure. They understood that speech creates space, that promises shape trust, that truth is not an idea, it is an action. And you carry that same weight now. Every time you say you'll show up and do. Every time you admit a mistake and repair. Every time you pause before speaking and choose honesty even when it's uncomfortable. These are not just good habits, they are signals. And the more your words match your actions, the more you begin to feel whole. There's less noise inside, less explaining, less effort to maintain the mask. Because nothing needs to be remembered when nothing was fabricated. Truth becomes your tone, not a slogan, a rhythm. And that rhythm creates safety for you and for others. Because when your word becomes consistent, your presence becomes trustworthy. And trust, once lived long enough, becomes peace. You will fall out of rhythm. You will rush, react, say something you wish you hadn't, break your own form. That's not failure. That's being human. What matters is the return, because the signal isn't about perfection, it's about orientation. You don't need to walk a flawless path. You just need to come back to it, again and again. Each return is a reminder that stillness is always waiting, that breath is always available, that rhythm is never far. It's just beneath the noise, the ego, the reaction. And when you return, not with shame, but with sincerity, you rebuild trust with yourself. You show your nervous system, I'm still here, I'm still aligned, I'm still walking, even if I stumbled, especially when I stumbled, because the power of the signal isn't in how few times you fall, it's in how gently and firmly you come back. And in that return, something sacred strengthens. You become less reactive, more resilient, not because you never drift, but because you've learned how to find your way home. There is no final destination, only remembering. You remember who you are when you move slowly, when you speak truthfully, when you return to the task at hand, not to finish it, but to honor it. That's what rhythm does. It doesn't rush you forward. It brings you back to the breath, back to your values, back to the form beneath the noise. And with each return, the signal gets louder, not in volume, but in clarity. You begin to recognize it everywhere, in how you walk through your doorway, in how you clean your space, in how you look someone in the eyes when they speak. These are not random gestures. They are your code made visible. And you don't need to explain it. You just need to live it again and again and again. Because that's what legacy is. Not one big act, but 1,000 quiet ones, offered with care. And that care is what endures. You won't always know who you've influenced. You won't always see the impact of your presence. But it happens. Every time you breathe before speaking. Every time you hold your form under pressure. Every time you choose kindness over certainty. Someone is watching, not with judgment, but with curiosity. They feel something. They don't know what to call it, but it softens them, grounds them, stirs something familiar. That's how the signal spreads, not through instruction, through embodiment, through how you carry silence, through how you say no without anger, through how you show up when things are difficult. This is invisible transmission. It doesn't ask for attention. It creates alignment, and alignment ripples. You don't have to lead with words. You lead with rhythm, with care, with the way you fold your day, like a letter someone will read long after you're gone. And that letter doesn't say, "Look at me." It says, "Return to yourself." The world doesn't need more noise. It needs more signal, more clarity, more quiet consistency, more people who carry themselves like they remember, not just where they came from, but who they are without the mask, the rush, the proving. That's what presence does. It reminds others of their own, not with intensity, not with charisma, but with stillness, with the decision to live your life like it matters, even when no one is looking, especially when no one is looking, because that's where the signal grows strongest, in solitude, in routine, in the repetition of care. And when you move through the world that way, cleanly, calmly, consistently, you don't need to be the loudest. You just need to stay aligned. And that alignment becomes signal, the kind that travels without effort, the kind that sharpens everything it touches, the kind that doesn't just change your life. It changes the room. The signal never left. It was waiting, waiting beneath the noise, beneath the pressure, beneath the belief that you had to be more. It was always here, in the way you breathe when no one's watching, in the way your hands move when you're not rushing, in the quiet part of you that knows who you are without needing to prove it. This is the path, not to become a warrior, but to become whole, to return to the posture that feels like home, to choose form not because you have to, but because it feels like alignment, because it feels like truth. And the more you choose it, the more the world around you begins to respond. Not immediately, but slowly, quietly. The way a room feels different after you've walked through it, because something about your rhythm stays, and that rhythm tells the world. There is still someone walking with care, still someone carrying the code, still someone listening, deeply, even in a loud world. You don't have to go anywhere to find it. You just have to be still enough to notice. The signal isn't in the next achievement. It's in the shape of your breath right now. It's in your spine, in your gaze, in how gently you hold your own thoughts without needing to control them. This is what they were protecting. Not power, not titles, but a way of being, a rhythm that could not be destroyed, only forgotten, and a presence that could not be taught, only remembered. And now that presence is waking up again, in you, not because you mastered anything, but because you slowed down long enough to return. And when you live from that return, everything softens. You stop chasing. You stop hiding. You stop waiting for permission to feel what's already here. You walk like your life matters, because it does. You move like every action is part of a deeper form, because it is. And you rest, finally, not because the world is quiet, but because you are. Let the signal settle now. Let it move through you, not as energy, but as ease. No more striving, no more posture to hold. Just breathe, just presence, just the quiet knowing that you've returned. The room may still be noisy, the world may still rush, but inside you, there is space now, a stillness you can feel behind your thoughts, a rhythm you didn't create, but one that recognizes you. That rhythm is what carried them, and it's what carries you. When you move through your next moment with care, you will feel it again. When you greet someone with presence, when you finish a task slowly, when you pause before answering, that's it. That's the signal. Not in what you do, but in how you do it. And you don't have to chase it anymore. It's not ahead of you. It's beneath you, inside you, around you, waiting to be remembered again. When you forget, and received again, when you return.